Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Climate Economics Podcast with me, your host, Arvid Viana. And today we are returning to one of the central concepts in climate economics, the social cost of carbon. That is the estimated harm caused by emitting 1 additional ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, we often talk about the social cost of carbon as if it were a single number. For example, under the Obama administration, many people became familiar with an estimate of around $50 per ton. But more recently, the US EPA produced an estimate closer to $190. But behind these headline numbers often sits a much wider academic literature containing different models, discount rate, damage functions, and assumptions about how climate change affects society. And we already covered how such models are built in episode 22 with Richard Toll. But what does the complete distribution of estimates in the literature actually look like? And do the experts themselves have an accurate picture of that distribution? And what would happen when you give more weight to the model structures and assumptions that experts consider most appropriate? Those are the questions addressed in today's paper. Synthesis of evidence yields high social cost of carbon due to structural model variation and uncertainty, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2024. And to discuss this paper, I'm delighted to be joined by one of its authors, Fran. Fran is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. She works at the intersection of environmental economics and climate science, and her research seeks to improve our understanding of the economic and social impacts of climate change and our ability to adapt to those impacts. She currently also serves as the Hurlston Presidential Chair in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy and is a UC Davis Chancellor's Fellow. From 2022 to 2023, Fran served as the senior economist covering climate and environmental issues at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden administration. So, Fran, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to have you on. We recently talked to Garno in a prior episode about tipping points, and then we also talked about the social cost of carbon and his best estimates, and he was heavily relying on this paper we are going to cover today. So I'm very happy to have you on to talk about it. I really think this is a really cool paper. So maybe just to start, could you talk about what the paper is about?
Yeah, so the paper is an exercise in really trying to get to grips with the really large and growing literature trying to estimate the social cost of carbon. And so what we're doing here is we're looking across a lot of papers. I think we have a kind of 150 in total that generate a lot of different social cost of carbon estimates. And we're trying to pull that literature together to synthesize it and then to dig down into understanding what is driving the variation in those estimates, and then also to kind of place that literature in a broader context of what does the community producing that work think of those estimates themselves, and then ultimately come up with our kind of best estimate of the social cost of carbon.
Yeah, because over time things have evolved. We've gotten better at modeling. So how then did you go about it, tackling this pretty big question?
Well, so I would say the first thing to do was to pull together a really excellent team of co-authors. So I really did kind of think of who would be my dream team of social cost of carbon co-authors and went out and recruited them. So I have a great set of collaborators on this because it is a kind of pretty major exercise to undertake in the first place. So we started by doing a kind of initial search through very structured search through the literature that involves taking certain keywords and putting them into the scientific kind of literature search engines that generated almost 3,000 abstracts. And then we had a team of RAs going through those abstracts to kind of pull out what were really original social cost of carbon estimates. And then the author team ourselves developed a kind of a data collection template so that each of us could go through a paper. We ended up with, as I said, I think 147. And so we could go through that and extract in a very structured way the social cost of carbon estimates that were being produced and the details of the modeling and the assumptions and the parametric decisions that went into creating each social cost of carbon estimate.
And so first of all, exactly, you pulled together all the estimates from the literature based on your review. So what kind of did you find in terms of the mean estimate and median estimate of the social cost of carbon?
Yeah, so if we just look at the literature, like kind of the raw literature, we just like sample over like all the papers and all the estimates equally, we find a 2020 value, a mean value of about $130 per ton. And it's that if we look across the distribution here, that distribution is very skewed. So the median value is much lower. The median value is about $40 per ton. But we have this long right tail that extends like really far up into quite extreme values, and that pulls the mean out to about $130 per ton.
Yeah. And I wanted to mention one detail that I was curious about. You restricted your analysis, I think, to 2000 to 2020 for the papers. Could you talk about the decision why you cut off papers before that?
Yeah, I think I think what you saw in the history of this literature is like papers coming before 2000 are really quite early in like the methods to generate the SEC kind of, I would say, had like largely stabilized, and there was a set of like integrated assessment models that were in use by the year 2000. That was Dice, Fun from Richard Toller, who you've had on the podcast, and Page. And so in the early 2000s, like those models were producing estimates. People were using those. And then kind of as you go on, like over the next 2 decades, you start to get like more, kind of all kinds of like new approaches and modifications of these models coming in. And so we wanted to capture like those estimates, but like before the year 2000, it was kind of a convenient cutoff that like, for a number of reasons, like methodologically things might be quite different, but also like maybe like some of the assumptions in those papers were just dated. We didn't want to say like it's every SEC estimate that's ever been made. Like I think it's fine to have a statute of limitations on these to some extent. And then 2020 was just because that's when we started working on this.
Sounds good. Perfect. Thank you. And then, first of all, I think the 132 is bigger than like the $50 by the Obama administration, because I think that just when I was doing my PhD, that was kind of the reference anchor point, so to say, of like, hey, this is what we're using, and then this was then later updated. So just wanted to highlight that. But then you also went further, and then you did a survey among the experts to what they thought was the social cost of carbon. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, that's right. So the initial task we set ourselves was to kind of comb the literature, to pull together the estimates, and to like kind of see what the literature had to say. And then we kind of realized, well, that's somewhat unsatisfying because the literature is not giving you like there's no kind of, it's not statistically interpretable, kind of the distribution that you're getting out of the literature. It's this kind of ad hoc sampling of like whatever people are working on. And so we kind of wanted to put that evidence in more context. And so we did this with this expert survey. My colleague, my co-author, Moritz Drupp, on this paper, who's now at ETH Zurich, has like done a few of these surveys, and he kind of really led this part of the paper. And so we reached out to the authors of the papers that were included in our study, and we asked them 3 questions, although they were like quite like intense like questions you had to think quite a lot about. And so we asked them like what their best estimate of the SEC was, and then we asked them what did they think the literature, the average in the literature is. And we were kind of interested in this wedge, like, do people perceive there to be some kind of systematic bias or like elements that are in the literature that are like different from what like a preferred SEC might be. And then we also asked them about specific modeling decisions that go into SEC estimates, particularly about like the structure of SEC estimates. So less about particular parameter choices like discounting, which has been discussed extensively, and more about some of like, exactly how is the SEC being calculated. So stuff about like the representation of the utility function, or the inclusion of like growth rate damages. And so we asked them about the perception of those types of SEC estimates, and essentially about the quality. And that was something we could then pull together with our literature review to kind of generate a preferred SEC estimate. And so oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, go. And because I find it very interesting, exactly, because then you get, and I mean, there were many things you did in the survey and then in the paper, and the one I think exercise that I thought was really interesting is how they perceive what all the experts that wrote the paper think the actual mean estimate of the social cost of carbon is, and then how it differs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was quite interesting, and so we had to spend a bit of time in the paper kind of trying to explain what might be going on there. So we asked our experts what they believe what they believe the literature, the distribution of SCCs in the literature to be, and they report a mean estimate that is about $60 per ton. So that's like less than half of what we found for the mean, and so there's a bit of a question of like what is going on there? Why are the perceptions from the experts like different from our estimates? I suspect there's a number of possible reasons. I suspect a big reason is to do with this long right tail that we find in the literature, and that there's these very extreme estimates that pull out a mean, and experts might not be familiar with that, might not be kind of integrating that into their mental model in the same way that we do. They might discount those estimates. And that could easily drive, if you were to like change that right tail a little bit, like it could easily move your mean quite substantially. And so I suspect that's what causes the experts estimate to be around $60 per ton. It's also close to what was a prominent estimate at the time, which was this Obama era kind of interagency working group value, which was around $50 per ton. So it's possible that the combination of kind of anchoring to that value and maybe discounting some of the kind of very extreme values that drives the estimate up.
One thought that I had is, are those more right-tailed estimates than also more recent estimates that they probably were not yet incorporated into the perceptions? Or were there some also more, I mean, I imagine there might also have been more right-tailed estimates earlier, like in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I don't think I can speak directly to publication here, but we do look at like what are the characteristics of like the values in the upper tail, and it's certainly true that a lot of the like recent literature that looked at growth rate damages like pulls the SCC out. So that is like a super important structural modeling like decision in how you calculate the SCC about how you model the persistence of damages on the economy. And those were quite recent papers. It may be that not every expert was like either super familiar with them, or they maybe like hadn't fully internalized just like how big they were compared to the others, and therefore like how it might kind of shift the mean estimate.
Yeah. Could you talk for the listeners what that is, like the impact on growth rates versus level rates? Because I don't think we've really covered that yet here. And it's also something you mentioned in the paper.
Yeah, so this is a debate that really got going kind of maybe 10 years ago, and it kind of generated through some like empirical studies that look at the relationship between temperature shocks and growth rates. And what they kind of find is that there seems to be like if you have an unusually hot year, that's like declines in growth rates in like particularly in like hot countries or poor countries. It's somewhat hard to distinguish, and that those growth rates are kind of don't like rebound the following year. So you have this like you have this like depressed growth rate, and then you kind of never recover that lost growth. So your economy is kind of like permanently smaller than it otherwise would be. And this differs in important ways from how damages are kind of traditionally modeled in integrated assessment models, which is where there's no kind of like from a temperature shock. Like temperature shock lowers productivity in 1 year, right? So your economy is smaller. But if that temperature shock goes away, then the economy rebounds and you actually kind of recover to your pre-existing growth path, right? So it's this distinction between is the climate like affecting having this like kind of temporary effect on productivity, or is it having this like effect on the drive of the growth? In which case, like the cumulative effect of like long run change in temperature is can be really large. And this is like this was an active, and still is an active debate, is kind of being identified as like a leading like driver in like variance in SEC estimates, but the kind of empirical questions around like, is climate affecting growth? If so, how? Over what time frames? If and how? Like, what are the mechanisms? That's still a very active area of debate. But like our analysis is like, because we're looking at like these structural choices in modeling, like we do pick up this choice, this like distinction between SEC estimates of like, how are you incorporating these, or like, are you incorporating these growth rate damages? It's like kind of first order importance in driving SEC variance.
I should also mention that your paper has an excellent breakdown of these types of explanations, like the importance of discounting in the range, in the distribution, the model parameters themselves, growth damages. And it's like for people interested or listening who are going to check the paper, it's like in figure 2 you get like a nice distribution there of the damages. So then you find exactly that the estimate that the experts find that their social cost of carbon estimate, like $142, is bigger than their estimate of the literature. So it's, which is an observation. But then I think what you then really is really interesting about the paper. So you've done the collection of estimates of the models. You've done the survey of experts, but then you take it one step further and you try to create your own synthetic social cost of carbon distribution. Could you talk about what you did there?
Yeah, I would say, this was like one of those papers that just like comes together nicely at the end. And we were kind of able to synthesize these like different lines of evidence, and that like it is kind of really nice to have a kind of a final product where it is kind of what you envisioned. Like, admittedly, maybe at that that was like 4 years ago. 4 years to get this paper to publication. So yeah, the observation is that the experts perceive there to be a kind of difference in like between the estimate of the literature and the estimate of like like preferred SEC, whatever that means. And so we also dig in then and we ask the experts about their perceived quality of these like different studies that are doing like structurally different things to the SEC. And what we are then able to do is we're kind of able to use that kind of assessed kind of quality to resample the SEC literature distribution, and to kind of simulate like what would be the distribution if we kind of corrected the set of estimates in the literature so they look more like the kind of have the characteristics of SEC modeling that like our experts think is like correct. And so that is so to do that you kind of need to have some statistical model so that you can like query that statistical model and say like, okay, what would the SEC be if it's like slightly, if we kind of tweaked it in a little way, if it was slightly different. And our model here is like we train a random forest model, which is a kind of machine learning approach because we have like a lot of different variables. We have a lot of like potential nonlinearities and interactions, and the kind of random forest approach is like good for like kind of teasing out some of those, and particularly like which ones are like most important in your estimate. And then we like query the random forest model with the expert assessment of model structure and also discounting, which that came from a prior expert survey led by Morris Strupp. And so effectively what this is doing is kind of reweighting the literature. So in any time you're going to take a bunch of estimates and like come up with a single distribution, you have to have some kind of weighting scheme.
Yeah.
Like that weighting scheme could be just uniform, which is kind of what we do in our first part of this analysis. Other approaches that have done like versions of this will apply often like author-based like kind of assessments. So there's like Nordhaus does this when he looks at like different damage estimates for dice, where he'll kind of say like, okay, there's kind of a quality weighting here across studies that I believe in, and I apply that. And so here what we're doing is we're saying, well, our weighting scheme comes from this expert survey. Um, and it comes from the expert survey, then it's kind of joint with like information that's coming from the random forest about exactly what variables are important to be targeted for reweighting, as in like what variables are actually driving variation in the SEC, and those are the variables that the random forest is going to select, and therefore those are the ones that are going to get like targeted kind of in this reweighting. And so that produces what we call a synthetic SEC distribution, in the sense that it's not like any one SEC estimate, but it's effectively a synthetic reweighting of the literature in this kind of very structured way that relies on expert assessment combined with the random forest model trained on the literature.
And could you give us an example of what the inputs are? Is it the types of modeling choices or even parameters? So, because I imagine, like you said, you collected a lot of information. So, could you just give an example of how this would work, of like what one of those inputs is?
Yeah. So and if people like want to go to the paper, I have if I say so myself, a really excellent explanatory figure in figure 4 that actually, like, the process of making that figure in response to review comments actually, I think, really helped us understand like what exactly we were doing here. And so the random forest model itself is trained on, like, we kind of throw in all the explanatory variables we have for each SEC estimate. And so that's about 30 variables, right? So that includes things like, did this estimate distribution include parametric uncertainty in the carbon in climate sensitivity? Was this estimate from the fund model? What's the SEC year of this, right? So you have SECs for like 2020 or 2050 or 2100. So that's a variable that goes in. What was the discount rate? Did this include distributional weightings? All of those are kind of like flowing into that random forest model as like potential explanatory variables. What the model then does, it kind of built these regression trees where essentially it's like there's like binary series of decisions that like sequentially like partition the data, and each regression tree will have like maybe like 5 or 6 or 7 like steps where it's doing that partition. And what the regression tree is going to do, it's going to kind of choose variables that are like maximally explanatory of like variance. So what variables are able to maximally like partition the data in this like binary way. And so that's where you're going to get like, not every variable is going to show up there. There are some variables that are more important. So if you can like look at what variables tend to get pulled out, and it's things like SEC year is important. So like the pulse year, like we kind of know that. Discount rate is important. Yeah. We kind of know that's important too. But then it pulls out some of these more structural elements too, like the inclusion of growth rate damages, and there might be some other things in there too. And so then when we ask the random forest model, give me a prediction, give me it's not a predicted value, it's a predicted distribution. Give me a predicted distribution for like an SEC value that contains like, and now I'm going to specify what I want, right? I want a discount rate of 3%. I want you to include like damages tipping points. I want you to include like, say, limited substitutability in the utility function between different types of damages. And I want you, the SEC year to be 2020, and I want you to include parametric uncertainty. Right. And then the random forest is going to give me a kind of an estimate of that based on these like multiple like partitions of the data. And so that's what that synthetic estimate is coming out. And we also do some kind of corrections of just like things we would like, right? So we would like a recent publication year, right? So to the extent publication year shows up in the random forest modeling, like it's going to bias towards choosing more recent publications than older ones.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Thanks for explaining that further. And then once you've done that, you've done all this work, what kind of distribution do you find with the mean versus the unweighted literature?
Yeah, so what we find it shifts everything to the right. So like all of the distribution moves higher quite substantially. And so rather than a median value of about $40 per ton, the median goes up to about $180 and a mean value of $280. And that's about, the median is increasing by about a factor of 4, and the mean is increasing by about a factor of 2. And so that is like quite a lot. And we can to some extent like decompose a little bit what is driving that increase. And so we think a lot of it's coming from them just updating discounting assumptions, but then there's a bunch that come from some of these like structural decisions about the SEC modeling, including like updates to the Earth system,
Yeah.
the inclusion of growth rate damages, and some estimates, some elements of, say, like parametric uncertainty as well.
And I should also mention, I think in the paper you have some really nice figures. Like, I think this is like figure 5, panel B,
Yeah.
in which you did, you show the different components, like how important is the damage function, how important is discounting, the uncertainty. So I highly recommend. I think it's a really nice graph, kind of giving you an idea of the different factors, that it's not all just coming from like different discount rates, because that's often, I feel like, the biggest, that's always like my prior, that has been my prior, that's often been just the discount rate driving a lot of this, but there's actually a lot of other things that are going on as well. So you found like this estimate of $283, and I'm like, I'm like, well, that's already much higher than what I had it, because in my mind it was somewhere too, I will admit, around like $120. And I think I was almost like this focal point, seeing some of the new studies, but maybe not all of them. Because, often when you read literature, it's like you go back to the primal things, or, bomb estimated. So I can definitely even see my own estimation of the social cost of carbon, how I might have been influenced by like the EPA. Like EPA like moved it up, and then there's some newer estimates. I'm not sure, the growth rates, it's still happening. But then when I see that distribution, I'm like, oh, actually, I feel like it's a very nice way of like updating your own beliefs, kind of showing what's happening. So when you brought out this paper, you showed this synthetic distribution, like, hey, this is actually more how you think about it. Have you seen a shift then in how people see the distribution? We talked a little bit before that, but before we started, but could you talk about that? How you've seen people's potentially shift?
Yeah, I do think, so there's a lot going on in this period. And I should just, in terms of timing, like our expert survey was done before EPA released its updated social cost of carbon. But the paper was published after, so we could like compare our numbers to that value, which we do in figure 5. And so I do think like, the EPA update was a big, like the estimate jumped a lot. And so it jumped from somewhere around like 50 to something closer to like 200. And so like, I think, and then also our paper came out. And what our paper is capturing, so the method that the EPA used in its modeling, I would say is quite conservative in a lot of ways. And in particular, it's not incorporating a lot of the structural elements that have been of interest in the academic literature and are potentially important for the social cost of carbon, including like this question about persistent or growth rate damages, but also including other things like inclusion of tipping points in the climate system, like different representations of utility function, either using like Epstein-Zinn utility or this kind of limited substitutability that accounts for like the particular damages from non-market effects of climate change. None of that is in the EPA's estimate, right? And most of those are going to move the SEC up. So if you're kind of looking at like, there's a whole bunch of like big improvements that EPA did that shifted it. And then like, if you could look at our estimate and say like, and if you did these other things too, it would like move it even higher. So I would say in terms of the community, like if we were going to do the same expert survey again, I suspect one, like estimates of the literature probably come up, but I think best estimates of the SEC have probably moved too, and are probably, before we were getting something on the order of, I think like 150, and I suspect now they would be 250 or more, based on a combination of the EPA's update of kind of this additional evidence from these like other types of like modeling that are captured in our estimate. And then there's also been even more recent estimates, like the kind of Bilal and Kanvig like empirical exercise using global temperatures that comes up with damages on the order of like $1,000 per ton or more. And so like all of that is like kind of pulling, gradually pulling, I think, the community's assessed values upwards.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And like it, and even like for example, this paper is like I said, pulling mine upwards because I was out for a while, and because I can even imagine that policymakers also, they don't follow particularly all the evolutions in the literature as well. So they may be, there might be even a lag for 5 years or something. So I think it's really nice. I generally like to ask the question is like, is there something like surprised you during the writing of this process that you hadn't anticipated before? So is there another word? Did you have some prior that you like updated while writing this paper?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, part of what motivated, I would say, the paper was the observation that, discounting has been talked about a lot, but there's all this other stuff going on too. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but like discounting is really important. So when we do a lot of the variance decomposition, I was like maybe a little bit disappointed that it kept popping out as like super important. But these other things are also important,
Yeah.
right? And so and discounting from a policy point of view, I do think it like when like the federal government uses the social cost of carbon, if it ever does so again, it just chooses a discount rate, right? So this kind of debate over the discount rate is to some extent academic because the federal, like the government, any given decision maker is going to have a discount rate that they will use, and
Yeah.
like academic input is going to like inform how that comes about. But it's not. It's like a kind of choice parameter rather than maybe something more like about like kind of scientific or genuine scientific or economic uncertainty about how climate damages manifest. So like how are they affecting the economy, say? And so like in that sense, I see the discount rate debate as like somewhat distinct from some of these other questions about like how bad are climate damages.
Yeah, yeah. Like for example, like how to model climate or tipping points versus, well, there's a choice of a parameter that government's going to make. That's not necessarily always in the modeling. So,
Mhm.
so you're slightly this. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I mean, the other thing, maybe I was like surprised at so we asked experts their assessment of the quality of like these different studies, essentially, like do you think a social cost of carbon that includes this element is preferred to one that doesn't? And people are pretty positive overall. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be that surprised that these are like collectively this is authors of like that literature that's been contributing into it, but like academics always find like problems with that tends to be that tendency is to find problems with the literature, with what's being done. And so like collectively I would say these these innovative elements that people have been introducing, I think are generally like pretty positively perceived, and like and to the extent they're not included in policy estimates at the moment, right? Some of these innovations, that seems pretty important, and that was maybe quite surprising.
All right, so slight disappointment that the discount rate kept popping up, but positive. Surprise that
Yeah,
the
right.
experts were that positive. And I will say, yeah, I mean, it is big, but it's also surprising to me, like the other importance of the other stuff. Then maybe one final top like point that I wanted to talk about is the importance of the dice model. Like we talked briefly with Richard Toll when I was doing it, like the huge importance of the dice model, and that a lot of models build on it, like because you even have it in your figure 5b, just like dice is like $70 dollars by itself. So how kind of was this incorporated that some of these models might be building on the same framework?
Yes, that's something we thought about very carefully when we initially did our data collection exercise. Because one thing we didn't want to do, we didn't want to kind of just keep like if people are like running dice a bunch of times, like the exact same version of dice, like we didn't want to like keep collecting that estimate repeatedly, right? Like, and so we tried to explicitly limit our data collection to like original SEC estimates, but that would include things like, okay, I took dice and then I modified it in some way. And so in those cases, what we would do is we would collect the kind of modified SEC would kind of count as a new SEC, but and we would also take their they like kind of original run of like the dice model, and we would record that separately. We call it like a base case that's like missing some modifications, and we actually use that variation in some of our identification
Okay.
to look at the effect on the SEC. But it is true that like that drives like the dominance of, I mean, not just the dice model, but like Richard Hall has published a lot of papers using
Exactly.
climate. Right, so like there are some like type of models that keep coming out, and then yes, a lot of the like innovations have been on the dice model, right? Because it is like so simple, it's so tractable, it's so clear, it's like really elegant in many ways, and so people have built on it. And that therefore a lot of the estimates are going to inherit like assumptions from the dice model, and that's why like what we do in this synthetic SEC to like kind of try and correct some of that, I think is important, right?
Yeah.
So to the extent people are just inheriting like the dice's like discounting assumptions, like we can try and correct some of that, or
Yeah.
like if they're inheriting something about the damage structure, like we can correct,
Yeah.
like partially correct that as well.
Cool. Thanks. Then, maybe final question: is there anything we haven't talked about on the paper that you still would like to mention? We've covered quite a bit, but is there anything comes to mind that you still want to mention about the paper that we haven't talked about?
I mean, this is maybe not so much about the paper, but I think the larger policy context is kind of interesting to talk about. So this was published in 2024. The EPA's kind of new social cost of carbon came out in the kind of end of 2023, I believe. Since then we've had kind of the new Trump administration, and we've had like a real like just kind of walking away, I would say, from the principles of benefit cost analysis that really motivate like why we are trying to calculate the social cost of carbon in the first place. That like the policy context for this in the United States is that for 50 years we've had this requirement that agencies do benefit cost analysis to kind of as an input into regulatory decisions, right? And the idea is that like agencies have a lot of power, and that they should be thinking about, collectively as a whole, like how are they using that power, and balancing the different interests of society in formulating regulations, right? And that's like so. And then when we start to come to climate regulations, what are the benefits of climate regulations? Well, that can be summarized kind of using the social cost of carbon. So that's like why it's important. And this administration has really just like walked away from those
Yeah.
principles by putting out benefit cost analysis that literally say like we don't care, like we're not monetizing the benefits of like it's complicated, but like we're repealing the regulations, right? And so that's going to have all these environmental damages, and we're just not even attempting to monetize those. You know, frankly, because we don't want to, and the numbers would not be conducive to the outcome, the political outcome that we want. And like on the climate, so they've done this on the air pollution side, using where it's to do with the value of statistical life, and then on the social cost of carbon side, they've also kind of had this this premise that like the SEC is just too uncertain, has been the claim, and we kind of can't use it. And that, I would say, it's like ridiculous, because if you're not monetizing like the costs, you're putting a precise value of zero on. And you know what we can do with our estimate? We can very confidently rule out a precise value of zero, right? So the probability, of like a zero SEC is exceedingly low. We can calculate it. And so that is just like completely like those decisions is completely inconsistent with what the evidence is here.
Awesome. I think that's a really nice way to conclude. So, and I couldn't endorse that more. So, Fran, thank you so much for taking the time. This is great. I think people are going to get a lot better insight into what's happening with these models, and also just being convinced, like they say, also that the experts themselves are positive about the inclusion of these new types of modeling. And then, when maybe the new shift comes in the administration, that's ready then to start using those updates. So, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for your interest in the paper. And I do know, like, I think the social cost of carbon literature can be quite overwhelming for for people coming into it. And so I do hope, I think this paper can be a useful entry point for people with some kind of technical background, but are kind of interested in getting to grip with the literature of a whole, and then kind of exploring parts of it that are of interest.
Yeah, and I can highly recommend. I read it. I think also the graphs and the explanations are really good. Like you said, like it breaks it down. I think the visuals are amazing. So couldn't endorse that more. So thank you so much.
Thank you.